Hi everyone, and welcome to The Wheelchair Activist with me, Emma Vogelman. Like any self-respecting millennial, I've had so many moments where I've thought, hey, I should start a podcast. So here we are. The Wheelchair Activist podcast will interview the incredible unsung heroes of the disabled community and show them succeeding in all different areas of life so that people know that anything is possible. I will also be covering my life as a disabled person with all of the highs, lows, and in-betweens. Today I am joined by the amazing Elisabeth Ward, who is an accessibility specialist at Scope. She's a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, and I'm so excited to dive into this episode.
People kind of pitied you, you were being told you were brave for kind of just living your life. I have to say that, I'm proud of my impairment. I've accepted who I am. I remember the first day I was in the Scope office and I walked into the office and there were, maybe 5 or 6 other disabled people in the office that day. And that really isn't that many, but for me it was 5 or 6 more people than I'd ever worked with. The more people that become aware of it, the more and more likely it is that those barriers won't be in place.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of The Wheelchair Activist with me, Emma Vogelman. And this week we are joined by an extremely special guest, a friend of mine and a colleague of mine at Scope. And before I introduce her, just that I can't think of a better person to be on this episode because at The Wheelchair Activist, I completely reject the idea that armchair activism, for those of you who don't know, armchair activism is this idea that you can only be an activist when you're physically lobbying, physically going and campaigning and protesting. But for us disabled people, so many times our options are limited to the way that we can go and make our activism known and change the world in our own way. And I can't think of a better person to have on for our first episode who perfectly embodies that than Elisabeth Ward. Elisabeth, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, Elisabeth, can you tell us a little bit about what you do? I call you my accessibility guru, my content accessibility queen, but can you talk us through a little bit about what you do and your career history? I know I said right now you work at Scope, but you've previously worked for the digital content team at Parliament, is that right?
Yeah, so I actually started in content marketing, and that was very much kind of creating lots of different types of content for a lot of different organizations. So kind of learning different tones of voices and kind of creating something that's like starting with something very complex and ending up with some simple engaging version that you would engage customers with, but that wasn't really anything to do with accessibility. It wasn't really accessible at all. So I moved to the Parliamentary Digital Service as a content designer, and that's kind of my introduction to the world of accessibility, because as a public service, it was absolutely essential that people can access information and they have equal access to that. So I kind of started on a journey of content design and accessibility. And then I moved to Scope as a content designer again, and I supported on the advice and support content that we have on Scope's website. And during that time, we had a lot of kind of research and testing with disabled people. So I was constantly learning more and more about the different, particularly digital barriers that people experienced. And that kind of led me to the role that I'm in now, which is as accessibility specialist in the partnerships team at Scope. Currently, the Big Hack, which is a whole website full of accessibility and inclusive design content, articles, and guides. And pretty much what I do now is I train individuals and businesses to make their content more accessible, both to customers or clients as well as employees as well. So it's kind of a bit of a long journey into it, but it was really good.
amazing. And before I ask you a rather big question, I have an even bigger question. So, at the Wheelchair Activist, obviously, our focus is around disabled people and the unsung heroes in the disabled community who are achieving and succeeding in so many different areas of life and different areas of work. But I want to ask you, what does disability mean to you?
That's such an interesting and complicated question for me. So I feel like I need to give a little bit of background because it's very much changed.
Please.
So I think I joined Scope about 4 years ago. So everything before Scope for me, what disability meant to me was very negative. It was, I was different to everyone else and I was hiding that. I didn't, you know, I people kind of pitied you, you were being told you were brave for kind of just living your life as you do, and it's that kind of narrative. It made me very
Mm,
ashamed of the disability. It was something that I felt I had to try and hide, try and get people to look past, and that's what disability meant to me. It was something that I didn't really want to be associated with, which is very counterintuitive.
mm,
Um, and then when I joined Scope, I discovered the social model of disability, which I know you know all about. But for anyone who doesn't, it is a model of thinking developed by disabled people that says that the barriers in society disable people, not an impairment or condition. And those barriers are caused by physical barriers, not having a ramp, or digital barriers, or really importantly, people's attitudes. And that for me is the biggest change that I've had, and what I thought disability was completely got flipped on its head. And what it means to me now is very, very different. Um, and I have to say that, I'm proud of my impairment. I've accepted who I am. Um, Disability to me is now a social construct. It's something that society
mm,
has the ability to take away. And it's something that I'm fighting for, that social change that's really important to me, that we make sure that others like me don't feel that disability is something that they own, but actually something that is done to them and that can be removed and taken away. Um, so
mm.
it's a big question. I don't know if
Yeah.
that actually made any sense.
No, it absolutely did. And I think that was another huge reason why you and I connected. So I was briefly sort of a half-ish member of your team, which, as you said, is the big hack team. When I joined Scope, I was on the consumer affairs policy team, so I worked really closely with your team to look at disabled people's access to food in the pandemic, and we looked a lot at sort of the online shopping experience. But in our weekly meetings and sort of getting to know you better, I felt really weirdly comforted when I learned that that was your experience with disability, because it's really similar to my own. And I felt like a lot of shame working in the industry that I do, and being a leader, if I can call myself that, in the disabled community, when I myself had a really negative attitude towards it and didn't consider myself to be disabled, didn't want any disabled friends or anything like that, because I felt like it would weirdly draw more attention to my disability rather than like give me comfort in a shared experience. So I mean, that's one of the reasons I think you and I connected so well, is because we both have very different disabilities, but yeah, a very similar mindset in terms of like how we've changed in our views of disability. And I'm really interested in seeing as you had sort of that attitude towards disability before working at Scope. Why is it that you decided to apply to Scope? Was it just sort of right place, right time type of thing, or what was that motivation?
That's a really good question. And I mean, I'd already always looked out for jobs at Scope because I think I knew deep down it would be a good place to work because even though I had separated myself so much from disability, I realized that it would be somewhere that I would feel comfortable and that potentially be somewhere that I could start to feel more comfortable in my own skin a little bit. Maybe it was kind of, I'd hit that point where I just kind of had enough of feeling that way about myself, but not really knowing how to fix it. So when the opportunity came to work at Scope, I was like, well, this is perfect. I finally get to work
Mm,
for a charity, which I wanted to do. I didn't really want to be doing a job that was just for income. I wanted to feel like I was contributing back into the world. And this was somewhere where it would be, I shouldn't really say this, but I kind of I describe it as I found my people. And
yeah.
because I suddenly, like, I walked in. I remember the first day I was in the Scope office and I walked into the office and there were, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 other disabled people in the office that day, and that really isn't that many, but it for me it was 5 or 6 more people than I'd ever worked with in close proximity, and
Mm,
that was huge. I just was like, oh, I found my place. And that was even before I learned about, the social model. I just suddenly didn't feel quite so alone. And I think I was just ready for that, to find that place, if that
mm.
makes sense.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I think that that's so interesting that, just seeing, other disabled people around you made you feel that sense of comfort and belonging. And, I think it's so interesting how people like us, and I know so many other people with disabilities, they'll go from this, really, I'm not disabled, and, I don't want to identify with this community, and then really, like you said, find our people. And I had a really similar experience, working at Muscular Dystrophy UK, which was when I started, like, my disability journey per se. So no, I think that that's super interesting, and yeah, we both happen to work for Scope. We both happen to really enjoy it. This is by no means, an ad for working at Scope. But but we're not being paid by Scope to do this, I promise. But it's a really good place to work, and I totally understand what you mean about that representation and Scope is, they are aware of that, and they take on board the fact that it's important to have that lived experience in the decision making roles. So the other
Yeah.
question I have that we haven't really touched on is, what is content accessibility? What is digital accessibility for people who don't know? Like, what's the super basic way that you would describe that?
So I guess digital accessibility is being able to access online, or the features on your computer when you have an impairment or condition, potentially with using assistive technology. So, assistive technology can be things like a magnifier on your computer that makes everything bigger. It could be a screen reader, which is, kind of a bit of kit that reads out everything that it's doing on your computer or the website that you're on. It can be things like having enough color contrast. So, the color on your foreground has enough contrast with the color in your background. That's quite a big issue for websites. So it can be a range of different things, basically making organizations aware that people access their services, their products in different ways, not the way that they necessarily expect them to, and making sure that those websites are built in a way that is accessible to that assistive technology. In
Mm,
particular, so content accessibility is kind of taking away some of that technical side, and looking at it from access for people that often get overlooked. So people that need plain English, to be able to understand the content, to be able to take actions, and things like if you're doing a presentation at work, making sure that you're kind of saying everything that's on your slides so that people who cannot see those slides, be it because of a vision impairment or because they're at the back of the room and they can't see what's on the screen, is getting access to that content. So it kind of ranges from a different sides of it, but
Mm,
essentially it's kind of making sure that if you're accessing things differently, and that could be due to an impairment, but there are still, temporary and situational impairments that
mm,
people experience that can also affect how you access content. So, an example I tend to use is trying to look at your phone in bright sunlight. That can be a situational impairment right there. So,
mm,
yeah, I guess that kind of covers as basic a explanation as I can do.
yeah. And I think it's so helpful for people to understand that because I know before I worked with you, I've lived with a disability my entire life. I've worked in disability since I left university. I think it's really easy to think that you know everything about disability and about accessibility, but I had absolutely no idea about the barriers that people with different impairments face when trying to do normal things online. And I learned so much from your training about the way that I write and, not to use too many metaphors or like illustrative language because that shuts out a whole group of people. And I think in terms of, things like you said about color contrast and stuff like that, it's so important that we're not shutting people out for little design reasons. We want as many people to engage with our content, whether that's me being, an independent blogger, podcaster, whatever, or a major company. And yeah, I've certainly learned so much through the training that I've done with you and sort of, the report that I worked on with your team, which looked at disabled people's access to food in the pandemic and learning how to write that in a way that the people who I'm trying to serve can also read it and get the information from it. So, yeah, it's such an interesting world. And I will say that since working with you, there are now accessibility barriers that I cannot unsee. If I'm on a website and or I'm scrolling through and I notice that if you hover your mouse over a link and there's no little line or there's no box that appears to sort of make it really obvious that that's a clickable link that's going to take you somewhere, I now can't not notice that it's not there and think, hey, that's a barrier for someone. And that's not fitting all of the accessibility guidelines that you're meant to be reaching for. So I thank you for making me think of that every time I go on a website or on an app on my phone or something like that. So yeah, thank you.
That feels so good to hear. It's one of those things, it makes me really happy to hear that because it's, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is awareness
Mm,
and actually getting people to think just like you are. I think next time you're on a website, just being like, oh my goodness, this thing isn't how it should be. And it's the more people that are become aware of it, the more and more likely it is that those barriers won't be in
yeah,
place.
absolutely.
And it's kind of everyone from your emails that you're writing. It doesn't even need to be customer facing roles. It's your documents that you're writing for colleagues, it's emails, it kind of is everywhere. So yeah, it's getting that awareness out.
Completely. Yeah, and it was something that was so important to me when I was building this brand, the Wheelchair Activist, was to make sure that the colors I was using were not only things that I liked, but that also met accessibility standards. And actually, before I launched the website, I had someone do an accessibility audit of it to make sure that it was as accessible as possible because I think, if I'm going to be interviewing amazing people like you and other disabled people who I admire so much, I I need to be practicing what I'm preaching. I need to be making sure that I'm not shutting out parts of our amazing community. So yeah, I if you ever get a chance to attend training done by Elisabeth, I cannot recommend it enough because it's just taught me so much. But I wanted to ask you, we talked about your shift in your thinking towards your disability, and I'm really interested to ask you, who were your role models growing up? Were they disabled people? Were they not non-disabled people? Yeah, who were they?
So I was thinking about this, and I don't think I really had many role models. There wasn't anyone that looked like me out in the world in public eye, let's say.
Mm,
So there was no amputees that I could really, or even more widely, the disability community that felt that I could look up to that were role models for me. I think that the only amputee that was really around when I was growing up was Jeremy Beadle, I think. And yeah, and most amputees always wore prosthetics, which again wasn't
mm,
really representative of myself. Prosthetics I've always found them more disabling than
mm,
helpful. And obviously that is changing now as we're seeing more and more amputees, particularly through Paralympics and such, kind of out there in the
mm,
world as role models. So I didn't really have anyone that was specific. I think looking back, my mother was a bit of a role model, and it's a bit of a cliche, but
mm,
she was very strong, very resilient, and really independent. She never really needed anyone to do anything for her. She would just get on with it. She'd find ways of doing it on her own, and she did, quite a lot of stuff on her own in kind of raising us, particularly with the challenges that I had, kind of taking me to all sorts of places with
mm.
prosthetics. I saying that prosthetics didn't help, but I had many, many attempts to find one that would help. So I think she didn't, she wasn't able to always do a lot of things for me, which left me to do those things on my own and find ways around, which meant that I became more
Mm,
independent and kind of determined. And that's particularly fed into how I am as an adult. That kind of determination to just like get on and find a way way around.
mm,
So
yeah.
even though if you'd asked me as a kid, I wouldn't have said that my mother was a role model. But looking back, I
Mm,
think she really did set a good example for me when it came to kind of overcoming the barriers that I was having. So yeah, I unfortunately I don't have anyone else.
mm.
But
No, but
yeah,
yeah, I think that sort of speaks volumes in itself, though, because I mean, I have to admit, when I was drafting that question to ask you, and I'll be asking other guests that question, I sort of was thinking, how would I answer it myself? And I completely agree. I didn't have people who looked like me as role models growing up. And I don't know if that's partly because of my reluctance to accept that I was different to my non disabled peers, or if it was also that, there weren't that many electric wheelchair users who were going out kicking ass and whatever it is that they chose to do. So I didn't have that either, and that's one thing that I'm really hoping is changing, and that was a huge motivation behind doing this project was, not necessarily that this podcast is targeted at young people, because if it was, I probably shouldn't say things like kicking ass. But I want young people and I want disabled people of all ages to look at people like you and the people that we're going to be having on this podcast and think that's really cool. And I now can find a way to see myself doing that if that's what interests you. I think there's such power in representation and being able to see yourself in any given area and achieving in whatever it is you want to do. Because I know for myself, I work in disability, I am disabled, but that's not the only thing that we can do. You worked on the, you know, digital content access, teams at Parliament, and you've done so many amazing things that aren't necessarily just about disability. And I really want people to have those role models going forward, no matter what age they are. And just when you were talking about the sort of ways that we have to, I think, overcome some of the challenges that we're met with, often think that disabled people and our families, particularly our parents when we're growing up, are the best creative problem solvers, because you have to figure out what are those little things that are going to work for you and help you overcome whatever challenge it is. And I don't know about you, I'd love to get your thoughts on it, but when disabled people are applying for a job and say that they get an interview, and the standard interview question is always, can you tell us about a difficult situation or a challenging situation you were in and how you overcame that challenge? Do you think that using your disability and sort of one of the little, like, creative problem solving that we have to do all the time, is that a good example for disabled people to bring up in that type of situation? Like, is it something you'd feel comfortable doing?
That's such a good question. I mean, I think it is. I think that's one of the bits of work that we need to do in reframing disability in a positive light. So being able to go into an interview and get asked that question and be able to say, well, yeah, this was really challenging. I found that I couldn't do X, Y, and Z, and it seemed impossible, but then when I creatively came up with the solution, and you're able to detail all the different ways, it
Mm,
just shows that having a disabled person as part of your team is such a massive, massive asset because of the challenges that you're presented with and the amount of problem solving that you have to go through to be able to,
mm,
you know, kind of make the world around you work for you. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't we wouldn't have to do that because everything would be designed inclusively.
yeah,
But in the way that it is now, we have mad skills when it comes to that, and I think employers
yeah,
definitely should be, wanting those kind of answers from us, and um, be using that skill set. I don't know whether some organizations are quite there yet, which is really depressing. But I
mm,
think the more that we are kind of not silent about it and kind of start bringing that forward, we can
mm.
maybe start to change their mindsets and actually put those kind of situations that we've been through into a more positive light, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It made me think of a previous role that I was in looking at disabled employment, and I was really lucky. I got to speak to this employer who worked at a huge, international charity, and before that, she had worked at Google, and Google at one point did this scheme where they were hiring veterans, from the armed forces to do roles, and my contact said that she was doing an interview with the veteran and, had the standard interview question. Can you tell us about a time that you were in a stressful situation and what you did? And his example was literally, well, I was in Afghanistan once and I was defusing a bomb. And the recruiter just got totally blown away by that answer because, I mean, first of all, can you think of a more stressful situation? But it just so
Absolutely not.
wasn't the, yeah, like it absolutely wasn't the example that she thought she was going to get. I think people are so quick to use a workplace example. I mean, not that that wasn't his workplace, but it's not an office. And it's not, oh, we had this deadline and we had to get this report out really quick. It was using a super unique lived experience that I think perfectly showed an ability to deal with a stressful situation. And it just really changed this one recruiter's perspective around using lived experiences in interviews and, to show that to, potential employers. And I agree with you that sometimes that's going to be met with, people being really impressed and realizing the value of that. And then sometimes it's going to be a less comfortable example because people don't always know how to respond to
Yeah.
disability, let alone, a really specific challenge that we've had to overcome. So I think between all of us, doing everything that we're doing, we're eventually gonna get there. So, we'll see, and we'll just keep using experiences like that in those types of situations, and not making light of them, not thinking that they're not something truly amazing because they are. They require a lot of thinking. They require a lot of, adaptability, which is so important. So I wanted to ask you, what is something that you are most proud of? And that could be personally or professionally.
So I would love to say something professionally, but it's just not true. The thing that I'm probably most proud of, and I'm a little bit embarrassed, but it just I don't know, it just is that I taught myself how to knit and crochet, and like that sounds just so mundane, but I'd wanted to do it since university. Well, knitting, it started with knitting. I wanted to do it since university, and I had a uni friend who was making this little strawberry hat for a baby, and it
Oh.
was like the cutest thing I'd ever seen. And I was watching her knit, and it was looked impossible. It was like, well, that's definitely a two-handed thing
Mm,
right there. I cannot see how I would do this. And then, like a few years later, I was in a shop. I think it might have been like Tiger, and it had everything, and they had knitting needles. And I was like, you know what? Sod it. I'm gonna buy these and work out how to do it later. And then I went online, I watched a couple of videos. There were no videos on one-handed knitting, which made it much harder.
mm,
But with a bit of trial and error, I worked out how I could do it. So I wound the yarn around my amputee hand, and then I stuck a needle under my armpit, and then I started knitting, and I kind of did it that way. And it wasn't ideal, it wasn't working super well, but it was working well enough. And then someone mentioned crocheting, which is where you've got a hook instead of knitting needles.
mm,
So, and you hook around. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. And then, being me, I was like, well, I'm going to give that a go. And I taught myself how to do that. Again, I've I've got a strap that holds my knife so that I can eat with a knife and fork, and I
mm.
repurposed that to hold the crochet hook.
Nice.
And yes, yeah, so like you've got all these little tools and things to find. And if I hadn't had that, there's like velcro straps you can get that could strap it to your hand and things like that. And I keep the thing with it is I just keep learning more ways to make it easier, or do it differently. So
Mm,
um when I learned how to crochet, it meant that I got better control with holding the yarn. And then I discovered I could knit with the yarn in my left hand, not wrapped around my amputee arm, which meant it actually just flowed a lot better, and it was just an easier knitting thing. And then I've
mm.
just discovered something called Portuguese knitting, which makes it again even easier. And um, there's circular knitting needles, which again I was like, well, that's impossible. That's definitely, you need two hands to hold both of them. And then I was like, I've had enough of this. I'm gonna find a way. So I bought some over Christmas, and I'm currently working out a way how to use a circular knitting needles. So yeah, I guess it's that coming back to that like personal determination, which I am very proud of. It
Mm,
it goes through all of my work in a professional environment is just my like constant determination. I will not give up on stuff. I just keep pushing through until I can solve a problem. And yeah, and part of that has come through on the knitting and the crochet, and now I have lots of things that I started with a ball of yarn, and now I have like usable things in my house, from placemats to blankets to hats. So yeah,
No,
not a very mundane thing.
I love that as an example because it it really would appear that, like you said, that's a two-handed thing. And I just love that you figured out a way to do it because it was something that interested you and that you wanted to do it. So, in a very Elizabeth fashion, you made it work. You figured out how to make it work. And I love that. And I have seen some of your projects that you've done. I just think I absolutely love them. So no, I love that as an example, and it really shows, if there is something that you want to do and you think, oh well, that's definitely impossible because of this impairment that I have. Really, not a lot is impossible. So no, I absolutely love that. So flipping the script slightly, what is the hardest barrier that you've had to overcome?
I think with this one, and we've touched on it a little bit, but I think for this one, it's attitudes more than actual physical barrier for me. My own
Mm,
attitudes to my own identity, kind of feeling really isolated, and I spent a lot of years really just hating myself, which that creates such a barrier because you're just
mm,
so disconnected to a part of who you are because you just don't feel it's good enough. And I spent a lot of my teen years really scared about what my future was going to hold, whether I was how I was going to manage things, if I was going to be able to get a job, would employers be able to look past it, you know um, kind of how
mm,
people treat you, and kind of being okay with getting stared at every time you leave the house. That's quite challenging, particularly when you're a young adult, trying not really hard not to take that personally, and that's just quite a big barrier to overcome. I found, just because it feels so
mm,
personal to you, and then just kind of accepting yourself, and once you do, everything became so much easier. And I feel like I
mm.
it's gonna be like I'm unstoppable. I'm not. I am definitely stoppable, but it
No,
just
you are. Take ownership of that.
it just like having that moment where I just really felt at peace with myself, really comfortable in my own skin. I realized how many barriers I was putting in place, how I was disabling myself more in public because I was trying to do things more one-handed so that I wasn't doing what would get me stared at, if I was
Mm,
like holding 4 billion things in my right arm, and like just all those little things that you kind of do, and I was doing it subconsciously, and I was disabling myself more. And I just moving away from like worrying about those attitudes of other people, and changing my own
mm,
attitudes towards disability and myself. That was probably the biggest barrier. And I just feel, and it's pretty much entirely down to the social model of disability. I feel really dramatic when I say that it
mm.
changed my life, but it just really did. And I really don't want other young adults, that are like myself, to get to over 30 years old before they have that moment and that
Yeah.
feeling. Um, because obviously there are a lot of big physical barriers, a lot of other challenges that you face as a disabled person, but I do think that attitudes are just it's the starting point for all those other barriers. So yeah, I
Mm,
think I think overcoming that is massive, both from a personal level and then as a changing those attitudes from a societal level as well.
yeah. And I think that that's so important. I think a lot of people can get in their own way, if that makes sense. A lot of people can sort of count themselves out of situations or workplaces or anything like that because of our own perception of ourselves that we're not good enough or that we can't. And I think it's even harder when you are disabled because you're not only self doubting, you're based on what you know that you can do or anything like that, but we're also thinking about what are all of these other people going to think of me? Are they as harsh? Are they going to be as harsh on me as I am on myself? And I, again, that was something that I really resonated with you, with that feeling of being stared at when you go out. And that it's something that I think a lot of well, anyone with a visible disability can really relate to, and sort of trying to, I don't want to say overcome your disability, but trying to, so I recently wrote a blog post about my sort of internalized feelings towards assistive technology. And this is something I actually owe a good bit to you in my change of attitudes towards assistive tech, because for so long I really resisted the idea of using a dictation software. I have a muscle wasting condition. I type all day, every day for a job, and those two things are really damn hard when you put them together. And I never wanted to use any type of software where I could just speak to the computer and it would type it for me, because I thought that it was like letting my disability win, and that I should be tougher, I should be better, I shouldn't give in to it. And it was only after I had started using that assistive technology finally and then had it taken away because my computer broke down that really hit me. I was making it worse. I was exactly like you said. I was disabling myself. And I thought, why am I doing this? It's you know, I'm not beating my disability by adapting my life to make things easier. I'm making my life worse. I'm making it harder. And yeah, it was something that I have thought a lot about since. And I since meeting you and knowing the like assistive tech that you use and that we talk about other people using and how it enables them to use basic services or just go on the internet and enjoy it like anyone else would, that it really occurred to me that it's not a bad thing to use it. So why am I getting in my own way?
Yeah, it's really challenging because it's so ingrained, and it's sort of comes back to like I just don't want to do things differently, and it's like actually doing it differently just means I can do it better, you know.
Mm,
But it's a really difficult mindset, and then you've got all these other um, external elements and different attitudes from others as well that make it hard to kind of block out those voices and those noises. And I think
mm,
one of the challenges I've had is that I've always sort of sat straddling between non-disabled and disabled, and in the eyes of myself and the world. I've had the co-founder of one of the first organizations I worked for told me that I wasn't disabled. And I was sat
oh,
there going, okay, so you've seen me at work doing things like what you consider everyone else,
mm,
and you've decided that I'm not disabled, and then that makes you feel like, actually, yeah, do I have a right to say that I'm disabled because I've found ways to do this? And,
mm,
when you need the extra support, you kind of feel like you shouldn't ask for it because, yeah, actually, you know, I'm not really being seen as needing that. And it gets in your head. And the things that people don't see from the outside. It's like, okay, so you don't think I'm disabled, but you're not there in the middle of my kitchen when I've just spread kidney bean juice across all of the counters and the floor because it's not opened. I've struggled to open it one-handed and it's just gone flying, and and there's chaos everywhere. It's just that kind of external attitudes, and then yeah, you take that in on yourself, and you end up adding um, more work because of those
Mm.
kind of ingrained societal attitudes.
I'm so interested in that experience. So, did your boss think that you weren't disabled because you were achieving to the same level, or was it a backhanded compliment? Like, how did it come across to you at the time?
I I think he meant it as as a compliment in a way, because he thought I was so adapted to the world, I wasn't disabled. Which, I
Hmm.
guess under the social model we can say that if I've got everything and I'm not experiencing barriers. But I think it was just that assumption that because you can see me doing everything in certain ways, it it means that I don't ever experience barriers in any other situation,
Hmm.
that, and it's also just telling someone who they are. So it's just,
Yeah. Not
so I
okay.
think, yeah, and it was kind of that like ableist, well, you're just like me, so I don't see you as disabled, and it's like, okay, but by doing that, we're not then fighting for things to be designed inclusively, or those barriers to continue
Hmm.
being challenged, because you can see on the surface that I'm doing things without barriers, but that's in, that small snippet of time that you spend time with me. Um, if that makes sense, and
Yeah.
even so, for him to say that, it's like, okay, so, but I also can't adjust my office chair properly because everything is on the right hand side and not the left, and I'm missing my right hand.
Hmm.
So that's a barrier that you've not seen, even though that's in an office environment, and I'm sat there like hopping up and down on my
Yeah.
chair trying to get it into a good position.
Yeah, I think that's really difficult because I think a lot of disabled people, and I'm certainly guilty of this in the workplace, where we don't want to be seen to be a burden or be an extra thing for your manager or your boss to worry about, that you just sort of muddle along and you figure out how to make things work. And by work, I mean like barely working, and not where you're feeling like you're thriving, you're achieving, you're succeeding in the way that you know that you could be. You just sort of make do, I think is perhaps the better way of saying it. And if people see that and they don't realize that, yeah, I was able to crank out that whole report in a day, but now my arm is so tired that I don't know if I can feed myself dinner. They don't see that side of our lives, and it's certainly something that I'm guilty of. Um, and yeah, I think to deny a part of your identity is pretty not okay in my perspective. But
It's
again,
so very
yeah,
it's very bold. It was just, and the thing is, actually thinking back to this, I think it was like a few months later, my one-handed keyboard actually broke, and I couldn't use it, and it took forever to get a replacement. It took months. So about 2 months working, I had to type on a full-size keyboard, and I had repetitive strain injury for that entire time, and it was
mm,
so painful, and I had so much work. I was still having to like work late and everything, and as you say, like you just push, you get by and you push through, but it's damaging to you
mm,
to, I spent a lot of time just taking painkillers because I was like, and to sort of
yeah,
think back to, it's like, well, you saw me non-disabled because I had a working keyboard, but as soon as that keyboard was broken, I became, you know,
yeah,
very, very disabled, and at, at the cost of of my quality of life to continue working so that you continued as an organization not to see me as disabled, and
Yeah.
not as valuable as other employees because I was working slower and struggling. So I kind of didn't. But yeah.
And I think that that's really something as well that I really want others to take away from this episode and from experiences like yours and mine, that don't suffer in silence. Don't. Yeah, I always say to people, learn from my mistakes, because it was a mistake for me to, like, exactly what you said, like, impact the quality of my life because I want to be seen as equal to my non-disabled peers who don't have all of the challenges and all the barriers that I do. And it's something that I'm definitely getting better at, but I think it's also important for people to know that even though, you and I are coming from a more experienced place now, and we are really lucky that we work for an employer that is very disability aware, obviously, and really understanding if we have good days where we can get a lot done, but then we have bad days where we're in a lot of pain or our assistive tech breaks and it's going to impact our workload, then we feel safe to be able to say that and get the help that we need. And a lot of people aren't in that situation. But I really want people to listen to this and think, actually, that sort of resonates with me, with the experience that I'm in now. And maybe I should spend some time reflecting on that and think, is there any software or any physical equipment that could allow me to work easier and allow me to get more enjoyment out of my life and out of my job? And maybe I should consider that. And yeah, I that's something I really hope that people take away from our experiences. And it leads me on, I think, you've touched on this a bit, but I'd love to know, what advice would you give young Elisabeth, or would you give young people like you with the same impairment that you do?
I think I think for my younger self, I would tell myself that it does get better, even when it's really tough. It always gets better. Things do improve. That was something I really struggled with. I just always thought it was going to be difficult, and it is difficult, and there are hard times. I have chronic migraines now, and I go through very much a sort of high and low with managing that pain. And at my lowest, I have to keep reminding myself, it's, this isn't forever. It will get better, because it doesn't always feel that way. um and I think holding on to
Mm,
that hope and knowledge that it will improve is really important, especially when you're a young person, because it can feel very negative and very difficult. um I think as well, I would say that being different is not a negative. There is so much you can offer by being different. There's so many different skills and different mindsets and points of view that are so valued and are that really needed in the world and in society, that benefit society. We have a place in this world, and we shouldn't be quiet, and we shouldn't kind of be afraid to stand up and push back when things aren't right. And that our voices do really
mm,
matter, our opinions and viewpoints matter. And that's something that I've only really, in the last few years being at Scope, feel that I have the confidence to be able to say that. I never really felt that I had a voice in
mm,
society, and I think we have to fight to do better. And I think my younger self, I wish I could have told myself to do that, and I could have been fighting all of these years as opposed to trying to fit myself into a box that you know wasn't wasn't going to fit.
mm. Yeah,
um so yeah, I guess that would be my advice.
I think it's a really interesting one, because I think so many young people, disabled or not, feel that they have to fit, like you said, into that box, whether it's unachievable beauty standards or toxic masculinity or, all of those horrible pressures that come from society. But I think when you're disabled and, I know for me, I am, I've always been a full-time electric wheelchair user, and I felt this real resentful feeling kind of towards myself because there were things that I wanted for myself, for my life, that were just never going to happen because, I am disabled. And now, like you mentioned earlier, you can get to a point where you can accept that and be proud of the differences and the experiences and all of that you do bring to the table. And it's difficult for young people to get to that place of acceptance, and I as well just really hope that people listen to this, they see people like you and me and all of the other people that we're going to be having on this podcast and realize that they are achievable. Like you said, things will get better. You're not going to be in, sixth form or high school forever where you feel that you have to, be the popular kid or, whatever it is that you feel that you need to be. The only thing that you actually need to be is yourself. And you need to feel comfortable in yourself. And then, the whole point of the wheelchair activist is whichever way you feel comfortable expressing that, and like you said, standing up for yourself is valuable. You don't need to go to a big protest and feel that that's the only way that you can fight for your rights. You can blog, you can go on social media. I don't honestly care how you do it. I just care that you try and that you care enough to try. And yeah, I just can't thank you enough for coming on this podcast and sharing the amazing experiences that you've shared with me and with the audience that, this is the first episode, so there will be more and more people who will come and find this and listen to your story and we'll learn from it. And yeah, just thank you so much, Elisabeth, for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really, really excited to see all the following podcasts. I say see, listen to all the following podcasts, and all the wonderful people that you're going to be chatting to and hearing all the different perspectives. Obviously, mine is just one. It's very, very different for lots of different people. But yeah, thank you so much for inviting me on here.
No, my pleasure. And I'm just so excited for all the other people that I'm going to be having conversations with, and just thank you, every single person, for listening to this episode. And I can't wait to see you in the next one. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening to this episode of The Wheelchair Activist with Elisabeth Ward. I've learned so much from her, and I know that lots of you will be learning things from her and from, hopefully, myself as well. I'm so excited to continue this podcast journey with you all to show you some amazing disabled people and everything that this amazing community does and achieves every single day. So make sure that you subscribe. You can follow the Wheelchair Activist across all social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff. And I will see you in the next episode. Have a great day.